Last day, wanted to try to get into something that a lot of people have a terrible problem with. And you know, stress causes about 93% of all disease. It will destroy you. It'll cause you to have cancer, a lot of diseases. It'll cause you to have a miserable life. Stress is a horrible thing, and a lot of our stress is caused by not being able to forgive somebody. And you know, this is a horrible weight. And if you have somebody that you hate and you haven't forgiven, that will bear on you as long as you don't forgive them. You'll have it on you. You know, it hurts you and it don't bother them a lick. That's what's really irritating. Your unforgiveness don't bother them. All it's hurting is you. And the greatest example in the world that has ever been of forgiveness is Jesus Christ. You see, they took him, they spit in his face, they ripped his beard out with their hands. They had a big old crown of thorns that were 3 inches long, and took a rod and drove it down into his head. And when he got beaten by the Romans and scourged, they used a cat of nine tails that had pieces of glass and metal woven into it. And they said when you would get beat with that your ribs would actually be showing the bones. And a lot of times those scourges would come around and take a person's nose right off their face and tear an eyeball out of its socket and rip their ear off. And it said that Jesus wasn't hardly even recognizable as a human being when they got done scourging him. Then they had to carry his cross. And they drove them big old nails in his hands and his feet. And they dropped that down to the ground. And the way you die on the cross is through suffocation. When you no longer have the strength to push your body up, you can't breathe anymore, and you die of suffocation. It's a slow, horrible way to die. And what in the world did Jesus say? Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. Now that's the biggest case of forgiveness I've ever heard of. Jesus, when he dwells in us, also gives us strength to forgive. We can have the power to overcome that hatred in our hearts through Jesus Christ. And if you've ever read the Lord's Prayer, it says, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who trespass against us. There was a deacon in the Bible named Stephen, one of the first deacons. And they took Deacon Stephen out and they stoned him to death. It says in the Bible, as Stephen was dying, he looked up to heaven and said, Lord God, forgive them. Do not hold this sin against them, but I ask you to forgive them. And he was just a regular man. So God will give you the strength to forgive. You think, how can I forgive somebody that did this and this? I had a little 5-year-old son. And it was, when I first married, I got married when I was 16. Been 16 a month and a couple of days. And I had Jimmy. And we split up. And about 3 years later, the wife, Sister Johnson, I have now, we've been married 48 years. And we had Jimmy staying with us, and we were raising him, and we had another little son, Patrick, and it was going real well. And one day, ex-wife, we'll call her Sue, called me up and said, I want Jimmy to come visit for Christmas. I said, well, she had full custody, there's not much I could do about it. So I said, okay, yeah. And they drove all the way down from Virginia. We was living in Ohio at the time. And and took him home. And a short time later, I got a phone call. And she said, Jimmy fell off his bike and is dead. And I said, what? So we grabbed a suitcase and drove straight to Virginia. I got there, I found out that Sue and her husband had had little Jimmy tied in a chair for 3 days, and they had burnt him with cigarettes. They had hit him so hard in the stomach that his stomach was ruptured, his brain was ruptured, he was bleeding out of his ears. They had pulled his fingernails, this is a 5-year-old, pulled his fingernails out with pliers. And the neighbors heard him screaming for 3 days and didn't do a thing about it. And after Jimmy was dead, they took him to the hospital. Well, he was arrested for murder. And I went to go to the trial, and she wouldn't testify against him, and he wouldn't testify against her. And he sat there while they were reading all the grievous things they had done to my little boy, and smiled. And I determined in my heart, it's the last thing I was ever going to do. I was going to kill that man. So the only thing he got sentenced for was taking him to the hospital after he was dead. So they were going to have the time where they told him what he was going to get for sentence. And it was about 3 months later. And I got a gun and I put it under the seat of my car, and I drove up there back to Virginia, and I went to reach under the seat of my car to get the gun. Now, I wasn't a Christian. I didn't know Jesus. I was playing on the nationwide television. I was playing in nightclubs. I didn't know God. And I heard a loud voice saying, "Vengeance is mine,